Good evening, and here we are, and continuing with BRAT FARRAR, and a quick reminder that where we left off last week, this is just before the horse race at Burrs, to double check to make sure he hadn't made the saddle girth too tight on Chevron, the horse, because she was highly excitable, and if the saddle had started to slip, she would have gone crazy. So he double checks it, and someone has loosened the girth. And the someone has to be Simon. No one else. So, onward. Bart tightened the girth and made for the start. Clint in white and scarlet on Operation Stockings. "You're Patrick Ashby, aren't you?" he said. "My name is Roger Clint." He leaned over and shook hands. "Very nice to have you at Burrs again." "Who won the bending race?" Brat asked. "I did, by a short head from Nell." Nell, indeed. "She won it last year on Buster, so it's just as well that the thing should go round. And I wanted a silver cup anyway." A silver cup. They were lining up, and he was number 5. And Roger Clint was away on the outside. There were 14 runners, and a considerable amount of jostling. There was no gate, of course, the start being by flag. Brat was in no hurry at the start. He let the others lead him so that he could gauge the opposition. At least 5, he decided, were horses that had been ridden so much today that they were of no consequence and were merely cluttering up the course and spoiling things for their betters. 3 more he had seen jumped in a junior competition and had no belief they would ever get round the course. That left 5 possibles, and of these, 3 were dangerous. A great raking brown youngster, ridden by a young farmer, and Roger Clint's mount. They took the hurdles at a tearing pace, and 2 of the overworked lot, fighting for position, struck into each other and rolled into a third. One of the junior jumpers came a frightful purler over the first fences going into the country and brought down the other 2 overtired animals. Chevron liked seeing her horses in front of her and was patently enjoying herself. She loved jumping and was taking her fences with an offhanded confidence. One could almost hear her humming. She watched the other 2 junior jumpers fail to get over a blind fence and flicked her heels in their faces. The field was thinning out very nicely. Brat began to move up. He passed the 5th of the possibles without effort. The 4th was making a noise like a pipe band, but seemed good for a little yet. In front of him, at the farthest point of the course, were the soldier on the bay charger, the farmer on the big young brown horse, and Roger Clint on the chestnut with the white stockings. Probably the best quality horse in the race, but, like the soldier, was riding like a veteran, and the farmer like someone who has no respect for his neck. It was a right-handed course, and the farmer's young horse jumped consistently to the right, so that no one could with any safety come up on the inside of him, as long as he hugged the turns tightly. And since no one wanted to go wider than they needed at the turns, they dallied a little behind the big brown until they could come into the straight and pass him without disadvantage. It was going to be a race when they came back to that last half-mile of park. Gradually, the pipe band that had been squads into the distance, and when they came back to the park, there were only 4 of them in it: the soldier, the farmer, Clint, and himself. He didn't mind about the other 2, but he very much wanted to beat Roger Clint. Clint had a look round as they left the country behind and flashed a friendly smile to him. After that, there was no time for courtesies. The pace was turned on with the suddenness of a tap, and the four of them pounded down the green avenue between the waiting for them at the other end. The big young brown horse began to sprawl, and the charger, though steady as a rock and apparently tireless, seemed to have no turn of speed to finish with. Brat decided to keep Chevron's nose level with the chestnut's quarters and see what transpired. Together they forged ahead of the bay and the brown. The farmer was using his whip, and his horse, the soldier, was sitting still on the bay and evidently hoping that stamina would tell in the end. Brat had a good look at Stockings and decided that he was tiring rapidly, and that Clint, from the careful way he was riding him, knew it. There were 2 hurdles to go. He had no idea how much speed or stamina Chevron might have left, so he decided that the same out of it. He shook Chevron up and took her up level with Stockings, as if he were making his effort. Clint increased his speed to match, and together they crossed the last 2 obstacles. Brat, still by his own choice, a little in the rear, and therefore out of Clint's vision. Then Brat eased the pressure momentarily, and Clint, taking it for granted that a falling back so near the post argued failing stamina, was glad that he would not have to for the last ounce, and relaxed a little. Brat gathered Chevron together with all his strength and came like a rocket from behind him. Clint looked startled and set Stockings alight again, but it was too late. They were far too near the post for that, as Brat reckoned. He had stolen the race. Of all the old soldier tricks to fall for, laughed Clint, as they walked their horses together to the weighing room. And Brat felt that whether Eleanor was going to marry him or not, he really did like Roger Clint quite a bit. Brat had expected that Simon's success would have shored up his disintegrating spiritual structure, and that the cracks would have disappeared. But it seemed that the very opposite had happened. The strain of the afternoon, followed by the triumph of having beaten a performer like Riding Light, had eaten away a little more of the foundation and shaken his equilibrium still further. "I've never seen Simon so cock-a-hoop," Eleanor said, watching Simon over Brat's shoulder as they danced together that night. She said it is one way to go offhand about his triumphs. Brat said that it was probably the champagne, and turned her away from her view of Simon. He had looked forward all day to dancing with Eleanor, but it was with Bea that he had danced first. Just as he had given up his first chance of a ride with Eleanor to walk on tan bitches with the ghost of Pat Ashby, so when faced with the moment of his first dance with Eleanor, he had found something else that he wanted more. He had crossed the room to Bea and said, "Will you dance with me?" They had danced together in a happy quiet, her only out of a race like that. "I didn't have to be taught. It's original sin." She laughed a little and patted him with the hand that was lying on his shoulder. She was a lovely woman, Bea Ashby, and he loved her. The only other person he had ever loved was a horse called Smokey. "I haven't seen much of you this afternoon since that awful exhibition of Tony's," Eleanor said. Brat said that he had wanted to talk to her before the race went. "Oh, yes, I remember. His uncle wants him to give up the farm and go and live in Ulster. His uncle is Tim Connell, you know, who has the Kilbarty stud. Tim wants to retire and would leave the place to Roger, but Roger doesn't want to leave England." Understandably, Brat thought. England and Eleanor together was heaven enough. "I don't see him here tonight." "No, he didn't stay for the dance. He just came to get a silver cup to take home to his wife." "His wife?" She had their first baby last week, and she sent him to the show to get a christening mug for it. What's the matter? She said. Remind me sometime to break Ruth's neck, he said, beginning to dance again. Ruth been romancing? She said he wanted to marry you. Oh, well, he did have an idea like that, but it's a long time ago. And of course, he wasn't married last year, so Ruth probably didn't know about it. Are you going to be all patriarchal and supervise my marriage plans? Have you any? None at all. As the night wore on, she said, you really must dance with someone else, Brat. I have, only with Peggy Gates. So you've been keeping track of me. Am I keeping you from dancing with someone you want to dance with? No, I love dancing with you. All right, then. This was perhaps the first and the last night he would ever dance with Eleanor. A little before midnight, they went up together to the buffet, tables in the balcony. The buffet was part of the actual hotel building, and the balcony, a piece of Regency ironwork, looked down on the little garden, at the side of the hotel. Chinese lanterns hung in the garden and above the tables in the balcony. I'm too happy to eat, Eleanor said, and drank her champagne in a dreamy silence. You look very nice in your evening things, Brat. Thank you. Do you like my frock? It's the most beautiful frock I ever saw. I did hope you would like it. Have you had supper already tonight? No, only some drinks and a sandwich. Better eat then. And that was new in Eleanor. It has been an Ashby occasion, hasn't it? The 74th annual show of the borough's agricultural... Stay still for a moment. You have a gnat crawling down your collar. She leant over and struck the back of his neck lightly. Oh, it's going down. In a rough, sisterly fashion, she bent his head aside with one hand while she retrieved the insect with the other. Got it? He said. But she was silent, and he looked up at her. You're not my brother, she said. I couldn't feel the way. In the silence, the beat of the distant drums came up from the assembly room. Oh, Brat, I'm sorry. I didn't mean that. I think I must have drunk too much. She began to sob. Oh, Brat, I'm sorry. She gathered up her bag from the table and stumbled from the dim balcony into the buffet room. I'll go and lie down and get sober. Brat let her go and sought counsel in the bar. There was some sort of stunt in the assembly room at midnight, and the bar, all by himself with a bottle of champagne at a table in the far corner. Ah, my big brother, said Simon. Are you not interested in the lottery drawing? Have a drink. Thanks. I'll buy my own. He bought a drink at the bar and carried it down the long room to Simon's table. I suppose lottery odds are too long for you, Simon said. You want the table rigged before you... I haven't had a chance of congratulating you on your win with Timber. I don't need praise from you. Simon was certainly drunk. That was very rude of me, wasn't it? He said, like a pleased child. But I enjoy being rude. I'm behaving very badly tonight, aren't I? I seem to be slipping. Have a drink. I've got one. You don't like me, do you? He looked pleased by Brat's dislike. Not very much. Why not? I suppose because you are the only one who doesn't believe that I am Patrick. You mean, don't you, that I'm the only one who knows you're not? There was a long silence, their odd, dark rim. You killed him, he said, suddenly sure of it. Of course I did. He leaned forward and looked delightedly at Brat. But you'll never be able to say so, will you? Because, of course, Patrick isn't dead at all. He's alive, and I'm talking to him. How did you do it? You'd like to know, wouldn't you? Well, I'll tell you. It's very simple. He leaned still closer and said in a mock confidential undertone, "You see, I'm a witch. I can be in two places at once." He sat back and enjoyed Brat's discomfort. "That I'm a lot drunker than I am, my friend," he said. "I've told you about Patrick because you were my posthumous accomplice." A wonderful epithet, that, and I managed it very well. But if you think that I'm going to make you free of all the details, you are mistaken. Then why did you do it? He was a very stupid little boy, he said in his airy Simon tone, and not worthy of latchets. Then he added without facade, "I hated him, if you want to know." He poured himself another glass of the Ayala and drank it. He laughed under his breath and said, "It's a wonderful spiritual twinship, isn't it? I can't tell about you, and you can't tell about me." Advantage of me, though. I have? How? You have no scruples. Yes, I suppose it is an advantage. I have to put up with you, but you have no intention of putting up with me, have you? You did your best to kill me this afternoon. Not my best. You'll improve on it, I take it. I'll improve. I expect you will. A person who can be in two places at once can do better than a loosened girth. Oh, much better. But one has to accept the means to hand. I see. I suppose you wouldn't like, in return for my confidences, to tell me something, who you are. Brat sat looking at him for a long time. "Don't you recognize me?" he said. "No. Who are you?" "Retribution," said Brat, and finished his drink. He walked out of the bar and hung for a little over the banisters until his inside settled down and his breath came more easily. He tried to think of some place where he could be alone to think this thing out. There was nowhere in the hotel. Even in his bedroom, Simon might join him at any moment. He would have to go out. He went to get his coat from number 7. "Has everyone gone crazy?" Bee said angrily. "Eleanor is upstairs crying. Simon is getting drunk in the bar. And now you look as if you had seen a ghost. What is the matter with everyone? Have you had a quarrel?" "A quarrel? No. Eleanor and Simon have had a wearing day, I expect." "And what makes you so white about the gills?" "Ballroom air. I'm from the wide open spaces, remember? I've always understood that the wide open spaces were just seething with dance halls." "Do you mind if I take the car, Bee?" "Take it where?" "I want to see the sunrise over Kenley Vale." "Alone?" "Definitely alone." "A coat," she said. "It's cold out." At the top of the rise, looking over Kenley Vale, he stopped the car and shut off the engine. It was still dark and would be dark for some time yet. He got out and stood on the grass verge, leaning against the bonnet, and listened to the silence. The earth and grass smelt strong in the cool damp after the sun of yesterday. The air was motionless. Far away across the vale, a train whistled. He had a cigarette, and his stomach felt up. The turmoil was now in his head. He had been right about Simon. He had been right in seeing the resemblance to Timber, the well-bred creature with the beautiful manners who was also a rogue. Simon had told the truth back there in the bar. He had been glad to tell him the truth. They said all killers wanted to boast about their killings. Simon must have longed often to tell someone how clever he had been, but he never could tell until now. He, Brat Farrar, was the safe listener. He, Brat Farrar, owned latchets, and Simon took it for granted that he would keep what he had taken, that he would keep it as Simon's accessory. But that, of course, was not possible. The unholy alliance with loading was one thing, but the alliance that Simon took so mockingly for granted was not possible. It was monstrous, unthinkable. And that being that, what was he going to do about it? Go to the police and say, look, I'm not Patrick Ashby at all. Patrick Ashby was killed by his brother when he was a little drunk. And then they would point out that in the course of their investigation into the death of Patrick Ashby, it was proved that Simon Ashby had spent the relevant hours in the Smiths Company in Clare. He could tell them the truth about himself, but nothing would be changed except his own life. Patrick Ashby would remain a suicide. How had Simon done it? One has to accept the means at hand, he had said. What means at hand had there been that day 8 years ago? The slackening of the girth had been a combination of planning and improvisation. The signing of the book suggestion had been a long shot. If it worked successfully to get him out of the way, then Simon was free to complete the rest of his plan. If it did not work, then no harm was done. The setup was innocent to the observer's eye. That was the way Simon's mind had worked about the girth, and that was the way it had worked 8 years ago, undoubtedly. The setup that was innocent and unquestionable. How 8 years ago had Simon used an innocent set of circumstances to provide him with the chance he wanted? Brat's mind was still toiling round and round the problem when the first sight of the stirring air told him that the dawn was coming. Presently the wind came again, lifting the leaves this time and ruffling the grass, and the east was gray. He watched the light come. The first bird notes dropped into the quiet. He had been there for hours, and he was no nearer a solution of the problem that faced him. A policeman came along at leisure, pushing a bicycle, and paused to ask if he were in trouble. Brat said that he was getting some fresh air. The policeman looked at his starched linen and accepted his explanation without remark. He looked at the interior of the car and said, "First time I ever saw a young gentleman getting fresh air alone after a dance. You haven't made away with her, sir, by any chance, have you?" Brat wondered what he would say if he said, "No, but I'm accessory after the fact to another murder." "She turned me down," he said. "Your grief. Take it from me, sir. A week from now, you'll be so thankful you'll feel like dancing in the street." And he pushed his bicycle away along the ridge. Brat began to shiver. He got into the car and headed after the policeman. Where could he get something hot? He asked. There was an all-night cafe at the main crossroads 2 miles ahead, the policeman said. At the cafe, warm and bright and mundane after the gray spaces of the dawn, he drank scalding coffee. A buxom woman was frying sausages for 2 lorry drivers, and a third was trying his luck at a penny-in-the-slot game in the corner. But beyond exchanging greetings with him, they left him alone. He came back to Burr's at breakfast time and put the car in the garage. The Checkers vestibule had a littered look. It was still only 7:30, and show people notoriously made a night of it. He went up to number 17 and found Simon fast asleep, with all his clothes in one single heap on the floor, just as he peeled them off. He changed into his day clothes, quietly at first, and then less carefully as he realized that only long shaking would wake Simon in his present condition. He looked down at Simon and marveled. He slept quietly, like a child. Had he grown so used to the thing that troubled him? Or was it that it never had been a monstrous thing in his estimation? It was a charming face, except perhaps for the pettish mouth. A delightful face, delicately made and proportioned. There was no more suggestion of wrongdoing about it than there was in the beauty that was timber. He went downstairs and washed, wishing that he had thought in time of having a bath. He had been too obsessed by the desire to change clothes without having to talk to Simon. When he came into the dining room, he found Bea and the twins having breakfast and joined them. "Nell and Simon are still asleep," Bea said. "You'd better come back with me and the twins in the car." "What about Tony?" "Oh, he went back yesterday with Mrs. Stark." It was a relief to know that he could go back to Latchett's with Bea in peace. The twins began to talk about Tony's exploit, which was patently going to be part of Latchett's history, and he did not have to make conversation. Bea asked if the dawn had come up to expectation and remarked that he was looking the better for it. Through the green early morning countryside, they drove home to Clare, and Brat caught himself looking at it with the emotions of someone who has only a short time to live. He looked at things with a "that will still be there" attitude. He would never come to Burrs. He might never even drive with Bea again. His confession meant the end of his life at Latchett's. It was Thursday morning, and on Sunday, Charles Ashby would come sailing up Southampton Water, and nothing would stop the subsequent celebrations. He followed Bea into the hall at Latchett's, feeling desperate. "Do you mind if I desert you and go into Westover? I think you are due a little rest from the family. Simon is forever running away." So he took the bus into Westover and waited until it was time for Mr. McCallan to be having his mid-morning coffee. He went to the Westover Times office and asked to see the files. The office boy, who showed no sign of ever having seen him before, took him to the cellar and showed him where they were. Brat read the report of the inquest all over again, but could find no help there. Perhaps in the full report there would be something. He went out and looked up Colonel Smollett in the telephone book. Where, he asked the colonel, would the report of the inquest on himself be now? With the police? Well, would he make it easy for him to see it? A most morbid and undesirable ambition, and implored young Ashby to think again. So, armed with the colonel's telephoned instruction, he went to see a highly amused police force who sat him down in a leather armchair and offered him cigarettes, and set before him the coroner's report of 8 years ago, with the empressement of a conjurer who has produced the rabbit from the hat. He read it all through several times, in greater detail. He thanked the police, offered them cigarettes in his turn, and went away as empty of suggestion as he had come. He went down to the harbor and hung over the wall, staring westward at the cliffs. He had a fixed point anyway, a fixed point that could not be altered. Simon Ashby was in Clare that day. That was held to by a man who had no reason for lying and no suspicion that the fact was of any would have been long enough away from Mr. Pilbeam's vicinity to make his absence felt. Pat Ashby must have been killed between the time that old Abel met him in the early afternoon and the moment when Mr. Pilbeam had to chase Simon home for 6 o'clock supper. Well, there was that old saying about Muhammad and the mountain. He thought the Muhammad theory over, but was stumped by the coat on the cliff top. It was Simon who had written that note, but Simon was never out of Clare. It was 2 o'clock when he came to himself, and he went to have lunch at a small pub in the harbour. He sat staring at his plate until they put the bill in front of him. He went back to Latchett's, and without going to the house, went to the stables and took out one of the horses that had not been at Burr's. There was no one about but Arthur, who reported that all the horses were safely back and all well, except that Buster had an overreach. "Taking him out like that, sir?" Arthur asked, nodding at Brat's tweed suit, and Brat said that he was. He turned up to the down as he had done that first morning when he took out Timber, and did again what he had done on Timber's back. But all the glory was gone. The whole world looked sick. He dismounted and sat down where he had sat that morning a month ago, looking out over the small green valley. It had seemed paradise to him then. Even that silly girl who had come and talked to him had not sufficed to spoil it for him. He remembered how her eyes had popped when she found he was not Simon. She had come there sure of seeing Simon because it was his favorite place for exercises the horses, because the horse by his side threw up his head as Brat's sudden movement jerked the bit. He listened to the girl's voice in his mind. Then he got slowly to his feet and stood a long time staring across the valley. He knew now how Simon had done it. And he also knew the answer to something that had puzzled him. He knew why Simon had been afraid that, by some miracle, it was the real Patrick who had come back. He got on the horse and went back to the stables. The great clouds were racing up from the southwest, and it was beginning to rain. In the saddle room, he took a sheet of writing paper from the desk. "Leave the front door on the latch for me, and don't worry if I am late." He put it in an envelope, addressed it to B, and asked Arthur to hand it in at the house when he was passing. He took his Burberry from the back of the saddle room door and went out into the rain, away from Latchett's. He had the knowledge now. What was he going to do with it? He walked without conscious purpose, unaware of anything but the dreadful question to be answered. He came to the smithy where Mr. Pilbeam was still working, and greeted him and exchanged opinions on the work in hand and on the weather to come, without having for a moment ceased to battle with the thing. He walked up the path to Tanbitch's, and up the hill over the wet grass to the crown of beeches, and walked there to and fro among the great boles of the trees, distracted and stricken. How could he bring this thing on Bee, on Eleanor, on Latchett's? Had he not already done Latchett sufficient harm? Would it matter so much if Simon were left in possession as he had been for 8 years? Who had been harmed by that? Only one person, Patrick. If Simon was to be brought to justice for Patrick's death, it would mean horror beyond horror for B. Do it at all. He could go away, stage a suicide. After all, Simon had staged Patrick's suicide and had passed a police investigation. If a boy of 13 could do that, he could do it. He could just drop out, and things would be as they were a month ago. And Pat Ashby. But Pat, if he could choose, would not want justice on Simon at the cost of his family's ruin. Not Pat, who had been kind and always thought first of others. And was Simon's monstrous supposition that he would do nothing? Was Simon to spend a long life, as the owner of Latchets? Were Simon's children to inherit Latchets? But they would still be Ashbys. If Simon were brought to justice, there would be no more Ashbys at Latchets. And how would it advantage Latchets to have its inheritance made safe? Was it not perhaps to uncover that murder that he had come by such strange ways to Latchets? He had come half across the world to that meeting with Loading in the street, and he had said to himself that so strange a chance must be destiny. But he had not imagined it to be an all-important destiny. Now it seemed it was an all-important one. What was he to do? Who could advise him, decide for him? It was not fair that this should be put on his shoulders. He had not the wisdom, the experience to deal with a thing of this magnitude. I am retribution, he had said to Simon, and meant it. But that was before he had the weapon of retribution in his hand. The police, tonight, tomorrow? Do nothing and let the celebrations begin when Charles Ashby came home? What was he to do? It was late that night that George Peck, sitting in his study and conscious every now and then, even from his distant vantage point in Thebes, of the lashing rain on the window of the rectory in Clare, heard a tapping at that window, and came back from Thebes and went to the front door. It was by no means the first time that people had tapped on that window late at night. In the light from the hall, he saw one of the Ashbys. He could not tell which, because the soaked hat. Rector, may I come in and talk to you? Of course, Patrick, come in. Brat stood on the step, the rain sluicing from his coat. I'm afraid I'm very wet, he said vaguely. The rector looked down and saw that the gray tweed of his trousers was black, and his shoes an oozing pulp. His eyes went sharply to the boy's face. Water from his soaked hair was running down his face. Take off your coat and leave it here, the rector said. I'll give you another one when you are ready to go. He went to the hall cloakroom and came back with a towel. Rub your head with that. Brat did as he was told, with the obedient air and fumbling movements of a child. The rector went through to the empty kitchen and brought a kettle of water. Come in, he said. Just drop the towel where your wet coat is. He led the way into his study and put the kettle on an electric ring. That will be hot in no time. I often make tea for myself when I sit up late. What was it? A pit in Dothan. What? I'm sorry. My mind has stopped working. Have you a drink of any kind? The rector had meant to put the whiskey in the tea as a toddy, but he poured a stiff one now, and Brat drank it. Thank you. I'm sorry to come and worry you like this, but I had to talk to you. I hope you don't mind. I am here to be talked to. Some more whiskey? No, thanks. Then let me give you some dry shoes. Oh, no, thank you. I'm used to being wet, you know. Rector, I want your advice about something very important, but confessional. I mean, without your feeling that you must do something about it. Whatever you say, I shall treat as confessional, certainly. Well, first I have to tell you something. I am not Patrick Ashby. No, agreed the rector. And Brat stared. You mean you knew I wasn't Patrick? I rather thought you weren't. Why? There's more to any person than a physical presence. There's an aura, a personality, a being. And I was almost sure the first time I met you that I had never met you before. There was nothing in you that I recognized, although you have many things in common with Patrick, as well as your appearance. What do you suggest that I should have done? Your lawyer, your family, and your friends had all accepted and welcomed you. I had no evidence to show that you were not Patrick. Nothing but my own belief that you weren't. What good would it have done to express my disbelief? It did not seem to me that it would not be long before the situation resolved itself without my interference. You mean that I should be found out? No. I mean that you did not seem to be someone who, judging by your visit tonight, I was right. But I didn't come here tonight just to confess to not being Patrick. No, that is only... I had to tell you that because it was the only way you could understand. I wish my mind was clearer. I've been walking about trying to get things straight. Perhaps if you told me first how you came to Latchets at all, it would at least clear my mind. I met someone in America who had lived in Clare. She thought I looked like an Ashby, and you were to pay her a share of the proceeds of the deception. Yes. I can only say that she earned her percentage, whatever it was. As a tutor, she must be remarkable. I've never seen a better piece of coaching. Are you American then? No, said Brat, and the rector smiled faintly at the emphasis. I was brought up in an orphanage. I was left on its doorstep. And he sketched for the rector the story of his life. I've heard it explains one thing that puzzled me, your good upbringing. He poured tea and added whiskey. Would you like something more substantial than biscuits, by the way? No? Then have the oatmeal ones. They're very filling. I had to tell you all this because of something I found out. Patrick didn't commit suicide. He was murdered. The rector set down the cup he was holding. For the first time, he looked startled. Murdered? By whom? His brother. Simon? Yes. But Patrick, what is your name, by the way? It's been called Brat. It was a corruption of Bartholomew. But my dear fellow, that is absurd. What evidence have you of anything so incredible? I have Simon's word for it. Simon told you? He boasted about it. He said that I could never do anything about it because it would mean giving myself away. He knew as soon as he saw me that I wasn't Patrick, you see. When did this extraordinary conversation take place? Ball. It wasn't as sudden as it sounds. I began to wonder about Simon long before then, and I challenged him about it because of something he said about knowing I wasn't Patrick, and he laughed and boasted about it. I think that the setting of this scene does a lot to explain it. You mean you think we were drunk? Not exactly. Elated, shall we say. And you challenged Simon on the subject, and Simon, with his perverted sense of mischief, provided you with what you expected from him. Do you really believe I have as little intelligence as that? Brat asked quietly. I considered you to be highly intelligent. Then believe me, I am not here because of a piece of fooling on Simon's part. Patrick didn't commit suicide. Simon killed him, deliberately. And what is more, I know how he did it. And he told him. But Brat, you have no evidence even now. That is theory, what you have just told me. Ingenious and likely theory, I admit. No evidence whatsoever. We can get the evidence if the police want to know the truth. But that isn't what I want to know. What I want advice about is, well, whether to let sleeping dogs lie. And he explained his dilemma. But the rector, rather surprisingly, in view of his silence about his doubts of Brat's identity, had no doubts on the subject at all. If murder had been done, the left. Anything else was anarchy. His point was that Brat had no case against Simon. His mind had run on murder. He had taunted Simon with it. Simon had one of his well-known impish moments and confessed. And Brat, after long thought, had found a theory to fit the alleged confession. And you think that I've been walking about in the rain since 4 o'clock because of a little joke of Simon's? You think that I came here tonight and confessed to not being Patrick because of a little joke of Simon's? The rector was silent. Tell me, Rector, were you surprised when Pat committed suicide? Exceedingly. Do you know anyone who wasn't? Suicide is a surprising thing. I give up, Brat said. In the contemplative silence that followed, the rector said, I see what you meant by the pit in Dothan. That was an excellent upbringing at the orphanage. It was a very thoroughly biblical one, if that is what you mean. Simon knows that story too, by the way. I expect so, but how do you happen to know? When he heard that Patrick had come back, he couldn't help, in spite of his denials, a fear that it might be true. There had been that other case, you see. That time the victim had survived by a miracle. He was afraid that by some miracle Patrick had survived. I know because he came into that room the first day and his relief when he saw me was almost funny. He drank down the rest of his tea and looked quizzically at the rector. In spite of himself, he was beginning to feel better. Another of Simon's little jokes was to send me out that first day on timber without telling me he was a rogue. But I suppose that was just his perverted sense of mischief. And still another of his little jokes was to loosen my girth yesterday before I started a race on Chevron. But I suppose that was just one of his well-known impish moments. The rector's deep eyes considered Brat. I am not defending Simon. He's never been an admirable character. But tricks played on an interloper, a pretender, even dangerous tricks are one thing, and the murder of a well-loved brother is quite another. Once, if he did not believe you were his brother, for the same reason that you didn't. I see. He would merely be held to be difficult. And of course, having got rid of one Patrick with impunity, he looked forward with confidence to getting rid of another. Brat, I wish I could convince you that this is a figment of your imagination. You must have a great respect for my imaginative powers. If you look back, critically and honestly, you must see how the thing grew in your mind from quite small beginnings, an edifice of your own making. And that, when Brat took his leave towards 2 o'clock in the morning, was still out of bed, but Brat compromised on the loan of a waterproof and a torch and found his way back to Latchett's by the snaking field path, with the rain still pouring hopelessly down. Come and see me again before you decide anything, the rector had said. He had at least been helpful in one direction. He had answered Brat's main question. If it was to be a choice between love and justice, the choice had to be justice. He found the front door of Latchett's unlocked, a note from B on the hall table saying soup on the ring in the pantry, and a silver cup on an ebony stand bearing a card in Eleanor's writing which said, "You forgot this, you blasé rodeo hound." The silent house, to his bed in the old night nursery. Someone had put a hot water bottle in his bed. He was asleep almost before his head touched the pillow. And next week, we will conclude Brat Farrar. Oh, my dears, thank you for joining me. I have so... As I said, next week is the conclusion. And thank you for being with me. Well, that's it. Thank you for being with me. Good night, one and all.